Welcome to TCG and our virtual service. We are so glad that you are joining us. I apologize that we were running a couple of minutes late. We had a little bit of technical difficulty. We're trying something a little bit new tonight. We record these every week. We do them live and we do them in my home office. And Alyssa is joining Holly tonight for worship, which is awesome, but it gets really squished when we all try to crowd on this side of the desk. So we were trying to get things set up so that we can attempt to use two screens in here tonight. So we'll see how well this works for everybody. I just want to say welcome. I am incredibly excited for us to gather tonight. I feel like I've got a heavy word on my heart and on my spirit that I'm excited to share with you. I also feel like it's been a heavy week and a complicated week. So I feel like we've got some things to process together. But before we kick anything off, I just want to kind of share a little bit of an update with you. As many of you know, we are virtual. And the reason that we are virtual is kind of twofold. We originally started this winter with a family shelter running in our church. And that was something that was really incredibly important to us, especially with all of our work that we do with families that are facing homelessness and poverty in our community. We did not and do not have a crisis cold weather situation for families where they can go and they can stay together. We were at capacity pretty much the entire time that we were open. And one of the things that happened was when Christmas hit and that cold snap that was so incredibly frigid, that Arctic blast of air that came, we actually opened an overflow shelter at National Avenue Christian Church and our wonderful friends and partners over there. And they quickly were close to capacity. And so we realized we kind of had a mathematical problem in that we couldn't merge both shelters into one space. And so we were able, thankfully, to access some funding between their faith community, our faith community, some ARPA funds that are coming in, thankfully, that we were awarded. And we transitioned all of our families that were currently in our spaces, plural, into hotels. And we partnered with a hotel that had kitchenettes that were, nice hotels that gave them some stability and families the ability to have shelter, not just at night like they were at our shelter, but really all the way around the day. They could cook, they could have a little bit more independence. And so we're still doing case management with those families. We're still checking on them regularly. And many of them are doing very well. Several of them have been joining us for services. So hi, everybody. But that has allowed us to do a couple of things. Our building is now really still set up for shelter, but it's really kind of on standby so that any night that our crisis cold weather shelters hit capacity, really within just a matter of a few moments, we can scramble to get some volunteers and be able to open our building as overflow shelter capacity for the city of Springfield right now. So we will kind of maintain this posture for the remainder of the winter. And the other reason that we maintain this posture, this is a conversation that I think is important for us to have too, as a faith community, is that for us, this is also an exercise in equity. I think that there is something that we don't talk about in the church a lot, which is the privilege of being able to gather in worship and the privilege of being able to attend worship, to have transportation for worship. And for us, when we meet on a Saturday night, as we do as a faith community, for members of our church family, of our TCG crew, we tend to call it, that do not have access to stable shelter, the way that our city system works right now is that they actually have to go to Grace United Methodist Church to have dinner and to be able to sign up for shelter. And we did not want to create a situation where someone had to choose between coming to TCG for worship and risk not having a shelter bed for that night. And so we felt like this was a really equitable way for us to be able to be flexible with our space, to steward it as much as we possibly could, but also to make sure that nobody is left out in our family and that we are all accessing worship from the same access point and being as equitable and just as we possibly could be in that space. So we look forward to being back in person. We are shooting now, I think, for the middle of March as a comeback to in-person worship services. So kind of tentatively in your calendars in pencil, plug that in. We'll be watching the weather to make sure that that should be fine. But that's kind of the plan right now. So very excited about that. Wanted to share that update with you because some of you have been asking what's happening at the church, what's happening with our building right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Holly and to Alyssa, who are going to lead us in some worship to get us started with just a really beautiful, non-traditional worship song that we use here very frequently. And then we'll dig into our message and kick off our new 2023 teaching theme for this year.
Can you hear? Blood red on the cold dark red falling down. Church doors, I can hear the organ song. Cross is gone. My city of ruins. My city of ruins. Now sweet bells of mercy on evening trees. Red on the corner like skates. Boarded up windows. Closed down. My city of ruins. My city of ruins. Rise up, come on, rise up, rise up, come on, rise up, rise up, come on, rise up, come on, rise up. My city of ruins. My city of ruins. Pray for these things. Now pray for these things. Now with me. Now with me. Pray for these things. Now with me. Pray for the wonders. Now with me. Come on, rise. Come on, rise up. Come on, rise. Come on, rise up. Come on, rise up. Rise up. Come on, rise. I see a good. I see a good. I just want to invite you in wherever you are, if you are in a safe place to do so, to just close your eyes for a second for us. We first were introduced to this song as a worship song, a song of just a song to honor our city. Every time we've played it, I think there's just an immense burden over these streets, over these buildings, outside of buildings, those who reside outside of buildings. And while the word city means a community, it means the it together. There is so much value in each individual life. To just take some deep breaths, and I want you to know wherever you are that you are valuable, that your life has purpose, has meaning, that you cared about. God, I take a second and pray over our city. I pray over the people who love our city. I put at home. I pray over the people who are frustrated, who are hurt. And God, I believe in the potential of Springfield. I see the potential and the hope of what the city could be. And I believe there's a lot of other people that join me in that space. God, I just pray that there would be comfort for everyone. God, for everyone that we love and hold so dear across the city. Glimmers of hope, that there is glimmers of joy, of moments that bring happiness. I just pray for space to just recognize where you are moving, where you are present. We love you. We love you when seasons come with extra stress and worry. God, I'm so grateful for your consistency. In your name.
So we tend to do things here at TCG when it comes to our weekly worship experiences, kind of with a yearly theme focus. A lot of faith communities will do these short series, right? Like a 6-week series on this or an 8-week series on this. And I think probably my nature and my personality is that I like to go deeply into topics. I want to explore them fully. I want to feel like we don't have to rush through them or abbreviate them in any way, shape, or form. And so we tend to kind of cast these big year-long themes. Pre-pandemic, our first full year of ministry at TCG, we did an entire year on the names of God. And every month we looked at a different name of God, and kind of explored those different names biblically and really kind of dove deeply into them and what they mean to us. During the pandemic, we kind of went through this year of vision, 2020 vision, and kind of talked about what that looks like to seek God's heart, to seek God's view on things. And man, we couldn't have scripted that any better with all the current events that unfolded in the year of 2020. And so, then we did an entire year on stories from the shadows, and we really pulled out in 2021 all of these kind of obscure stories, characters that maybe only briefly got a one-sentence mention in scripture, and what can we learn from them as well and their lives. And it challenged us, probably my toughest preaching year, to really challenge me to look deeply into some of these characters. Last year, in 2022, we spent the entire year talking about the book of Psalms. We talked about how David and other poets and artists who contributed to the Psalms were just incredibly beautiful and relatable, and that the humanity, showed through in so many of those spaces. We talked about all of the different places of relatability with mental health and our emotions in the Psalms, and just really felt, I think, a lot of connection and affirmation there. So as we go into this year with 2023, we kind of talked through and wrestled with our teaching team here a little bit, but it really wasn't a hard decision for us to figure out what we want to talk about this year. And I think a lot of what we want to talk about this year has been shaped by some of the events of the last year or so, some of our experiences as a faith community, as leaders, as the level of maybe brokenness, like Holly and Alyssa was saying about, that kind of Bruce Springsteen saying, my city wins, but I'm going to rise up. I'm not going to give up on this space. I'm not going to give up because things seem hard right now. And so what I want to spend this year really digging into is the red letters of Jesus. And so we're going to spend all of 2023 looking at different words that Jesus spoke. What do they mean? What do they mean in context? What do they mean for us today? How do we apply those in our modern pursuit of following Jesus? What does that mean for us as believers that are in a completely different context in some ways than what those words were spoken into, but how do they still echo and how do they still apply today? And, here's one of the things that I think I wrestle with, and that is sometimes when I look at faith communities, when I look at churches, when I look at religion, when I look at, large expressions of organized Christianity, some things that I really struggle with is sometimes I think that we give more weight to black letters in scripture than we do to red letters. For example, there's an entire segment of denominational belief that just completely puts full weight behind the words that Paul wrote to Timothy about women and women's place in the church and women's roles in the church, and that women should be silent and should not lead. Yet Jesus doesn't ever say that. And so we're going to talk about that this year. And where are some of those places that those things kind of maybe create some tension? But instead of digging into those issues, we've got entire segments of faith communities who said, well, it's printed there, so that's the way that we're going to do that. I tend to think that we need to be making sure that red letters and black letters line up. We need to make sure that we are not just following Jesus, but we're really digging into what Jesus said, what Jesus called us to, and how we are to live our lives. So I did a little bit of a Google search this week, and I was just curious. In terms of the most sought after, the most Googled Bible verses, were they red letters? Were they black letters? Were they Old Testament letters? Where did they fall? And so the top 10 monthly searches, this is worldwide, for Bible verses. I'm going to read these to you in order, and then I just want to see if you noticed what I noticed. So John 3:16, Jeremiah 29:11, John 10:10, Proverbs 3:5, Matthew 28:19, Philippians 4:8, Philippians 4:6, Romans 8:28 tied with James 1:3, Proverbs 3:6 tied with Ephesians 2:8, and then Romans 3:23. So if you notice, only 3 of those are red letters of Jesus. And so sometimes I think we tend to gravitate to other parts of scripture because sometimes I don't think we always necessarily know what exactly to do with these teachings and these stories and these lessons that Jesus taught. And so that's what I want to spend this year talking about with you. I want to dig into this. I want to dig deeply into this. And so, where do we start? Well, I think that there's a pretty obvious starting point for us this week, given the events of this week. If you have not been watching or paying attention this week to some of the things that have happened in our community, allow me to just give the 30-second overview. You're on to follow my personal Facebook post this week that kind of diaried the events of this week. And so these events started out on Wednesday, when Wednesday morning, Bob and I started getting phone calls from just concerned citizens that noticed there seemed to be a high presence of law enforcement in different wooded areas in our community. And so we got a call about one. And then before we could even get all the way over there, we got a call about another. And before we got over there, there was a call about another. By the time the day had fully played out, we had 8 different locations that we'd received phone calls on. As we kind of did some digging and did some exploring, we discovered that 13 individuals were arrested for trespassing in the first degree in our community, underneath a new law that was passed and just went into effect on January 1st in Missouri, which is called House Bill 1606. House Bill 1606 calls for the criminalization of homelessness at a state level. And if an individual is now trespassed from state property, it's no longer just an ordinance violation. It's actually a misdemeanor. It now carries a $750 fine instead of a $100 municipal fine on state property. Instead of just a book and release, it carries 15 days in jail. It has a lot of complicated pieces to it. It has a lot of pieces that actually make addressing the issue of poverty and homelessness in the state of Missouri much more difficult. One of those pieces, which is incredibly counterintuitive, is that if a community's per capita homeless rate, which means if they're the using the HUD's point in time count, which is not accurate, but it's the count that they call us to use. If that point in time count is above the state's per capita average, then the community now under this new legislation actually loses money to combat homelessness and to provide affordable housing. Springfield's already over that per capita rate from last year, and that was with a point in time count that was not very thorough and wasn't very accurate. And so, we have this situation that has started playing out in our community, a situation that we all really kind of feared would be the case when this bill took effect. And that is, our city police have a protocol that they try to use when they can. And that protocol calls for 24-hour notice for an individual to be given a warning to get ready to vacate a property so that they have time to connect them to resources, social service agencies, case managers, things like that. So we can try to figure out, is there something to do besides just arrest this individual? And fortunately, the other main law enforcement entity in our community, which is our sheriff's department, does not follow a protocol. And Wednesday's events at these different camps around town that was very coordinated was mostly in the activity of our sheriff's department. So there are a lot of concerns. There are a lot of frustrations. These individuals were arrested Wednesday when the weather was in the 60s. I talked to one gentleman who was wearing pajama bottoms, a tank top, and flip-flops when he was arrested. The problem is we live in Missouri where the weather's incredibly inconsistent. And the very next day, overnight, many of you remember what happened, right? It was 65 and beautiful on Wednesday. We woke up Thursday morning to snow. And snow that accumulated to about an inch in our community, about half an inch. So when individuals were released Thursday from the jail, they were released in the same clothes that they were picked up in, with no coats, not anything to keep them warm. They were released in the evening after agencies were closed. They were not given resources. They were not given, some of these pieces to help them. And they also weren't able to get their belongings, which meant that vital documents were lost, prescriptions were lost, clothing was lost. These kind of activities, when camps are closed down and don't follow a proper protocol, it's a very violent closure. It often leads to a lot of expended resources when we have to replace everything over and over again. And so it was really frustrating for all of us. It was heartbreaking to watch. It's concerning because we have over 2,500 people in this community in Springfield that meet HUD's definition of homelessness. At any given time, we can have about 800 of those individuals that are literally on the streets and don't have a place to be. On a night like tonight, it is too warm for crisis cold weather shelters to be open. The campers do not open on the weekend. And so I got a text message about an hour and a half ago before we started this stream that was from an individual who was trying to help someone. They said, I have a 55-year-old woman. She's handicapped. Is there anywhere that she can go? There's only one answer tonight. And, those kind of things, if she would have not been a female, there would have been zero answers because she didn't have an ID. And so, Victory Mission, Harbor House require gentlemen in this community to have an ID. They can't be a registered sex offender. And so there's a lot of layers to this. There's a lot of complications to this. But the thing that I think is really important, something that I think we saw on high display this week. The comment sections were definitely pretty visceral this week. There was a lot of conversation around this topic, around what I shared on Facebook, around what the sheriff's department posted, around some pictures and some concerns with authenticity. Issues of justice, no matter what issue of justice. But in this case, this week, poverty and homelessness and shelter instability, issues of justice tend to bring out the best and the worst in humanity. They tend to rally us and catalyze us to action and to coming together and to doing amazing things like we saw this community do during Christmas week when we pulled together to stand up 7 extra shelters in just a couple of days, when we pulled together to open up the Expo Center to provide warmth and an extra day shelter for people, when people just started showing up with food and blankets and all of these things. And here we are only a few weeks later, and the same topic is now incredibly divisive and ugly and angry. And some of the comments that I read, and some of the comments that I read from names that I recognize that are in leadership in other faith communities in this city, absolutely broke my heart. I got a message from one such person, a personal message that they sent me that said, "You're just a troublemaker. Why are you attacking good people that are just trying to do their job?" And, I pondered it for a minute and I thought, you know what? Most of the people in Jesus's day called Jesus a troublemaker because Jesus didn't come to cater to the privileged. Jesus came to challenge the powerful. Jesus came to include the marginalized. Jesus came to set tables of inclusivity. Jesus came and he spoke up and he spoke out and he challenged us to do better. And that is why I think is this is the timely topic for us to be digging into um, this this whole year of what do we say? What do we look at about the words that Jesus has spoken and how do we apply them to our life? I don't think that there is a better example for loving out loud than how Jesus lived. Jesus lived his life as a complete model of what it was to love out loud, to challenge people, to bring people in, and to inconvenience himself at the expense of helping others. And that's what his words and his teachings call us to do. And it's not easy and it's not comfortable. And let's be incredibly clear about that. So I want to start with Matthew 25. I want to start with this verse that we really have kind of built our entire church upon, that we really leaned heavily into as we were wrestling with our own um, call into church planting a few years ago. And so let me just read for you a few of the red letters of Jesus. And it says this in verse 40. And the king will say, I tell you the truth. When you did it into the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. And then the king will turn to those on the left and will say, away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire. For when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked and you didn't give me clothing. I was sick and in prison and you didn't visit me. And then they will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not help you? And he will answer, I tell you the truth. When you refuse to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you refused to help me. So let's spend a few minutes talking about that passage. How do we apply that passage right now, today? I think we start by applying this passage by really realizing something really critical and really fundamental that I think we get wrong in the church most of the time. And that is this, that that passage is calling us to a perspective, to a way of life, not just to a performance. Right? Matthew 25 is not an invitation to scorekeeping. Matthew 25 is not, oh, look at what I did. And let me post on social media my selfie of this great act that I did and a picture of me helping someone. Matthew 25 is not a call for us to boost our pride and our ego by helping people. And Matthew 25 is also not a place where we can start to say, you know what? I have done so many good things. I don't deserve to have bad things happen to me. Or I've done good things, so I'm exempt from doing other things when a need comes across my path. I think we need to start in this place because oftentimes I have conversations with believers who feel like I did something, check, right? Like I participated in a service day 2 weeks ago. So I'm following Matthew 25. Matthew 25 isn't something that we schedule. It's not something that we say we're going to do this service event. We're going to do this to help this community. Matthew 25 is this call that says, I have a heart to see the needs around me in my community, to meet the needs around me, and to be activated that when those moments come, when I see someone that's hungry, when I see someone that's cold, when I see someone that doesn't have shelter, when I see a kiddo that is struggling and needs a mentor in their life, when I see a family that's in crisis, that I'm motivated to try to not just turn a blind eye, to not just ignore the need, but to do something about that need. Here's the other thing. Matthew 25 doesn't have a caveat in it. So when COVID hit, we were still on Commercial Street, as many of you know, and we were renting space in Commercial Street. And all of our community, along with the state and the country, and really the world, was shutting down, right? We were told to shelter in place. And we were looking around us as social service agency and faith community just made decisions one right after the other to close their doors and to close down. Um, I remember vividly gathering our leadership team into a conversation. And I said, here's what I'm struggling with. I can't find a caveat in Matthew 25 where it says to take care of those that are in need, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to care for the wounds of the injured, to be there for people in need, unless it's dangerous, unless you might get sick, unless it's not convenient, unless it's a public health crisis, unless it's a pandemic. There's not a caveat anywhere in scripture, right? Unless it's not convenient, unless someone else is called to do that work. And I think we have to keep that in mind. So often we use Matthew 25, I think, as kind of some of these holy scapegoats. I saw that a lot during Christmas week. I've seen it a lot and a lot of times, but recently, when I started making phone calls to other churches and asking churches if they would open their doors and they would be willing to shelter individuals when temperatures were forecasted to get negative 25, negative 35 wind chills. One of the things that I heard over and over and over again, and y'all, this is like one of those Christian catchphrases that just rubs me the wrong way. And it's this idea that says, when I'm on the phone and I'm talking to you and I'm saying, can you open your building? Would you consider opening your building? We'll bring you cots, we'll bring you blankets, we'll bring you food. I'll find you volunteers. I just need your building. I need a safe, warm place to keep people warm. And the comment that I heard a couple of different times was, that's not work that we're called to do. We're called to do other work. And I struggle with that so much because I feel like whether it is as a faith community that is trying to create their mission statement, or if it is as an individual believer that's trying to create which pieces that we want to follow because they're comfortable and they're easy, we tend to approach Christianity like it's a buffet. And we tend to come to this buffet and we tend to say, I'm going to take me some of that and I'll take some Jeremiah 29:11 and I'll take some of that Proverbs 3:5 over there so that I can get some direction on my path. And like, I'm going to take these pieces because, hashtag the best is yet to come. And that's what we view Christianity like. And I'm going to challenge you that Matthew 25 is like the plate that you're walking to the buffet with, and like whatever other pieces you want to focus on and be a part of, that's a call that nobody gets to ignore. That's a call that if we say we believe in Jesus and we claim to be Christians and we claim to be followers of Jesus, and especially if we are a faith community, we don't get to say that that's something we're not called to, because that call is inherent to all believers, right? When Jesus was here and he modeled this for us consistently, he modeled for us what it looked like to serve, to have a heart that approached the margins, that says, I see you, I hear you, I'm here to serve you, less of me, more of my Father, right? This idea that we are coming into this space and we are serving is not something that we get to pick and choose. And part of the problem that just breaks my heart to its very depths is that so many churches have chosen that that's not work we're called to in our community, right? We're called to maybe invest overseas. We're called to maybe do this ministry and nothing else. And again, we pick and choose what our pieces are. And I understand that we've got to find focuses. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, if we have hungry people standing in the shadows of stained glass and steeple and we're ignoring them because we'd rather be doing something that's more comfortable or something that looks better, I think we've got to wrestle with our soul as churches. And I also think that that is a big part of where we see this holy disconnect between people who have pushed away from faith communities and organized religion and people that have said, when I look at scripture, when I look at the red letters, why don't I see this being lived out more? Part of my heart as a faith leader, part of my heart as a pastor is this idea that I've talked about here at TCG many times, and I call it prophetic love, right? It's this idea that I am going to love the potential in something, and I'm going to commit myself to loving that potential out of something. And here's the thing, I prophetically love the church. I believe in the call of the church. I believe in the design of the church. I believe that when the church walks out the calls and the commands of Jesus Christ, and we are willing to engage in those spaces and meet needs, that there is nothing more powerful than a church that's in that space and operating in that space. But unfortunately, there is a gap that exists between what the church is capable of and what the church is called to, and oftentimes what the church looks like today. And the same could be said for just our individual walks. And I think a lot of us wrestle with those spaces, right? Of what I know I'm called to, but what I struggle to walk out. Those gaps that exist. Part of my heart and part of what I think Jesus did too was not just teaching privately, but publicly challenging and saying, how do we do better? How do we do things differently? How do we change the dynamic? How do we move the needle? How do we change this community and this culture through love and mercy and grace and compassion? And through that, we become agents of justice. And that is why I love the potential of the church. And that is why I am committed to constantly challenging the church to do better because we're capable of better. It's why I get engaged in conversations like what happened this week with our community leaders, many of whom have boldly proclaimed their faith in spaces in this community. That if you proclaim to be a believer of Jesus and we treat people in ways that are less than valuable, worthy, and humane, that we have a disconnect and we have a gap between our calling and what we're walking out. And prophetically, I'm going to challenge you in that space, that I'm going to love you and support you and invite you into conversations and tables and actions that force us individually and collectively as bodies to do better. I get a lot of pushback and I get a lot of criticism because I challenge and because I do challenge, but I challenge out of love. And one of the things that I want to challenge us all this year, and one of the reasons I want to have this conversation about the red letters of Jesus all this year, is because my hope and my heart is that we can set Jesus free from the box that we have created and we have shoved him into in so many spaces in Christianity, so many spaces in our own lives, right? Like, this is the time that you get. This is the day of the week that you get, Jesus. This is the time of my day that you get. This is what I'm willing to engage with. What would it look like if we unboxed our faith and we took the barriers and the boundaries off of it and we allowed ourselves to be completely immersed and our entire life really changed and impacted in how we walk that out if we allowed these red letters to saturate not just our quiet time, not just our church attendance, but to literally saturate how we engage with the world and how we can make this community a better place for everybody that calls it home. I'm excited to dig into this here with you because I believe with everything in my being that the red letters of Jesus are critical. I believe that they are challenging. I believe they're convicting. I think that they're passionate, but they're also inclusive and they're incredibly catalytic. If we lean into these spaces and these passages and what they genuinely mean and what they call us to, we don't just look different as people, but the church begins to look different as a collective, and our communities begin to look radically different because they are impacted by this loving out loud that becomes a lifestyle and not just a checklist item. And that begins to grow, not just from Springfield, not just from Missouri, but from this country begins to spread as this wave of love and compassion that we have always been called to. But if we're being honest, we often struggle to walk out because it's hard. You know, a lot of church planting networks, a lot of church leadership networks lean into this New Testament passage of Acts 2, right? And they lift up Acts too as kind of this story of the early church and the story of, you know, everybody was sharing everything that they had and their belongings, and they did life together and they did meals together, and numbers were added to them daily, right? And here's what I want to challenge you with. I think a lot of times in faith spaces, and so faith leaders, church planters, you know, network leaders, I'm talking to us right now for a second, but this applies to all of us as believers. Okay. A lot of times we want that Acts 2 kind of growth, right? Numbers were added daily. We want that Acts 2 kind of growth, but to get that, you have to do two things. Number one, you've got to do the Acts 2 kind of work. You've got to do relationships and community and life together. But number two, you've also got to do Matthew 25, because it's the Matthew 25 kind of work that includes people and extends the margins and brings people into proximity where they can have a seat at the table, where they can see a different view of what faith is all about. It's not the religiosity, it's not the legalism, it's not the do's and don'ts, it's not the judgment, it's not the criticism, it's not the hatred, it's not the division, it's the love. It's the compassion. It's the mercy. It's the goodness. It's the heart of Jesus being walked out as we become the mouthpiece, the hands, the feet, the heart, the hugs, the love, the wrapping of swollen feet, the tending to frostbite, the bringing of food, the handing out of coffee, the wiping off of tears. That is what it looks like to walk out Matthew 25. So when Jesus proclaims these words and he says that what you have done unto the least of these, you have done unto me, I'm going to challenge you this week and focus on it this week and then make it a habit to continue to integrate this into your life. How are you treating people that come across your path? How are you viewing people that come across your newsfeed? When stories of injustice come across your timeline, do you react to it in a way that's like, "Oh, I'm so glad they finally are taking care of this issue"? Or do you think, "Oh my gosh, what happens to these people? Where are they supposed to go? What are we supposed to do?" Do you allow yourself to be moved? Not just in a momentary, like, you know, stirring up of emotion, but allowing that emotion to saturate your being and propel you into question asking, to propel you into research, to propel you into learning about the reality of situations and not just the stereotypes that are being perpetrated, and to perpetrate and to push you into action, into involvement, into advocacy, into being an agent of change in this world and in this country. I'm gonna challenge you in that space because if we don't get that right, if that foundation's not in place in our lives individually, and as our lives come together, that's what the church is made up of. The church isn't a building. The church isn't stained glass and steeple and scheduled worship services. The church is us. And so we can put up the billboards and we can proclaim that we're welcoming to all the people. But if we don't walk that out every day, if we walk by people with our church logo on the back of our car and we drive by while somebody's flying a sign, or if we walk by with our Jesus t-shirt on and we walk past someone who just ran away from a domestic violence situation and has no idea what to do, and we don't ask them if they're okay or if they need help, then the church collectively, because it's made up of people, is falling short of that. No slogan, no tagline, no amazing logo, no flashy worship service, no powerful sermon, no great worship set, no fog lights and you know, laser lights are ever gonna close that gap. The only thing that closes that gap is our hearts and us leaning into those spaces and saying, I need to wrestle with how I view the least of these, how I treat the least of these, how I engage with the least of these, what I believe to be true about the least of these. And some of those are really messy, hard spaces, and I recognize that. Jesus didn't turn away from messy, and neither can Holly and Alyssa are going to close this with a worship song that came out several years ago. It came out several years ago, and it was written by a worship leader who left the church because he struggled so much with the division that he saw, the gap between what scripture calls us to do and calls us to be and the political nature that he saw being walked out. And really, it was the border crisis and the fact that families were being torn apart at the border and children were being put into cages and those kind of, you know, images and headlines that were filling our timelines at that time, where he had to wrestle with hard conversations that he was having and the theology of those hard conversations. And so he wrote this worship song as a prayer and a cry for the lost, but not how the church often views the lost. He wrote this as a prayer and a cry to the church, feeling like the church had lost its way and had lost its connection with the red letters of Jesus. And so I want to invite you to just listen to these incredibly beautiful and powerful lyrics. The song is called The Hymn for the 81%. And if you've never heard it, and after you listen to it tonight, I invite you to add this to your playlist, whatever your streaming service is, and meditate on these lyrics this week because this is a powerful call and change of perspective for anyone personally who claims faith, but also for us as a collective faith community, capital T, capital C, the church. You're okay.
Do the same. So imagine my sister. We're gonna start over. Sorry. I grew up in your churches, Sunday morning, evening service, tears at the foot of the cross. You taught me every life is sacred. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked. Learn from you the highest law is love. Believed you when you said that I should trust the words in red. Guide my steps through a wicked world. I assume you do the same. So imagine my dismay when I watched you lead the sheep to the wolves. You said the love, so I'm loving you now. You said speak the truth, I'm calling you out. Why do you live the way that you did in my love? May love overcome and justice go down. putting kids in cages, ripping mothers from their babies. And I wrote for you to speak on their behalf. But all I heard was silence. Oh, worse, you justified. Sing glory, hallelujah, raise the flag. Your fear had turned to hate when you baptized it with language. Pages of the good book. You weaponize religion, and you wonder why I'm leaving. I'm Jesus on the wrong side of your road. Take love the lost, I'm loving you now. It's sweet and I'm calling you out. We live the way that you wouldn't mind now. Make love overcome, justice go down. Make love overcome, justice go down. May love overcome, and justice roll down.
Oh, friends, I know there's probably many of you on here who resonate with that. So many of you on here that are fighting with us in those spaces, and I hope that there's been some spaces of challenge tonight and continued challenge. We love you. We are grateful for this space. We are grateful for this community. We're excited for the day we come back together and excited when that day it's not a space like Christy said where it's privilege and just the ability to the ability for us to all be able to gather again. I will think we together collectively challenge you to do something this week that is aligned with the letters of the Bible, something out of your comfort zone, that is beyond what you would imagine yourself doing. Finding places to come, we would love to help
Tomorrow.
to help encourage you to find that. So one of our big events coming up this week, we have a Zoom tomorrow night, Sunday night at 7 o'clock. I was gonna say, I thought it was 7 o'clock. It is on our church page, so go look that up. Mark interested in it, or that you're and it's just a chance to learn all the different ways to connect with us and the work that we're doing in the community with the Family Connection program. I get to run and to lead with our outreach programs, our street outreach, providing meals for individuals working at our outreach center. There's a whole bunch of anything fostering help left on some of our animals that are in need of a place to call home for a little bit. So please join us and consider joining us and find a place to plug in and help us make this better for everyone that calls the city home. So we love you. We'll be back at this time next week for service, but we hope to see you sooner. Have a good week, you guys.